Our last two elasticities are the income elasticity of demand and the cross-price elasticity of demand. The income elasticity of demand measures the percent change in quantity demanded that results from a 1% change in income. The letter Y here in economics usually represents income. If you've taken a macro class, you're used to seeing that. Otherwise, it might look a little bit odd at first, but that's fine. So we're basically looking at how responsive consumers are in adjusting their quantities in response to income changes. So we're looking at the measurement here being the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in income. And again, we can write that out in longer form as the change in quantity demanded divided by average quantity demanded. And then we're dividing by change in income divided by average income. And over here we have the expanded one, which is identical to the other calculations we've been looking at. So the main thing we're interested in with the income elasticity of demand is the sign. If we get an income elasticity that's negative, that tells us that we have, when income is going up, quantity demanded is going down. Or when income is going down, quantity demanded is going up. Either of those would give us a negative measurement for this elasticity, and that would identify that we have an inferior good, that the quantity demanded moves in the opposite direction of the income changes. If we get a positive measurement, that tells us that our income elasticity that our good is a normal good. When income goes up, quantity demanded is rising, giving us a positive elasticity measurement. Or if income is going down, quantity demanded is decreasing. Negative divided by negative would still give us this positive measurement identifying that we have a normal good. So when we talked about the price elasticity of demand, we said that because price and quantity demanded always move in opposite directions, we tend to ignore the minus sign and look at the absolute value. With the price elasticity of supply, we always get a positive measurement, so we don't have to worry about minus signs. Here we have to be very careful because the sign is the main thing that we're interested in. And so we have to be careful not to ignore what direction the change is taking place. For normal goods, we sometimes make a further distinction. For inferior goods are simply inferior. It doesn't matter how large or small the measurement is. If it's negative, it's an inferior good. But for normal goods, if the measurement is between 0 and 1, we sometimes interpret that as being an economic necessity. So our income elasticity measurement looks at percent change in quantity demanded divided by percent change in income. So a fraction between 0 and 1 would tell us that the change in quantity demanded is small relative to the change in income. So if you have an increase in your income, you might buy more of some necessities, but you're not going to buy a lot more of them because you're already consuming pretty much what you need. And if your income goes down, the necessities are the things you're not going to give up in large quantities. And so we get a relatively small reaction. Economic luxuries, though, on the other hand, when our income goes up, we're already satisfying most of our necessities, we're going to buy something perhaps more luxurious. Or when our income goes down, those are the first things that are going to go. And so we get a relatively large quantity demanded response, and so we might interpret that as being an economic luxury. So when we look at the income elasticity of demand, the other difference it has between the price elasticities is the price elasticities told us how price and quantity change as we move along a demand curve or as we move along a supply curve. The income elasticity of demand tells us something about how demand shifts in response to income changes. It helps us identify, do we have a normal good or an inferior good? And the size of the elasticity measurement helps us identify how big the shift is going to be. So our final elasticity is the cross-price elasticity of demand. So this measures the percent change in the quantity demanded of one good in response to a 1% change in the price of some other good. So here we're talking about relationships between complements and substitutes. How do we respond? How does our consumption of one good respond to changes in the price of a related good? Our measurement here looks at the percent change in the quantity demanded of one good X divided by the percent change in the price of some other good Y. We can expand the calculation just as we did in the other cases, looking at the changes divided by the averages. So the cross-price elasticity of demand is sometimes a little bit counterintuitive. So let's suppose that we have an increase in the price of some good Y, and we would expect then to see a decrease in the quantity demanded of that good, moving along the demand curve for good y. Now suppose that we also see a reduction in the quantity demanded of good x. That would tell us that these two goods are complements. We adjust our consumption the same. And so the consistency in the quantity demanded response tells us that we have complements rather than substitutes. When we measure the elasticity, though, we're looking at this change, the decrease in the quantity demanded of good x, divided by the increase in the price of good y. And so we're going to get a negative measurement anytime we're talking about complement goods. Similarly, let's suppose that we have an increase in the price of good y, and that leads to a decrease in quantity demanded of good y, moving along the demand curve, but it also sparks an increase in the quantity demanded of some other good x. Now we're identifying that the two goods, we're substituting more of good x in exchange for good y, shifting away from consuming good y, consuming more of good x. And so we would identify then that these are substitute goods rather than complements. In our elasticity measurement, we're looking at this change divided by this change, and we're going to get a positive measurement anytime we have substitutes. So, if our cross-price elasticity of demand is negative, that tells us that we have complement goods. If our cross-price elasticity of demand is positive, that tells us that we have substitute goods. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. The knee-jerk reaction is to get both of these reversed. So we have to be a little bit careful about identifying negative measurement always tells us we have complements. Positive measurement always tells us we have substitutes. And in between the two, we could get a measurement of 0, which simply means that one good's quantity doesn't respond to changes in the other good's price, and we would interpret those as unrelated goods. So for example, if there was an increase in the price of bicycles, how would that affect the quantity demanded of coffee? Well, it probably wouldn't, and so we'd get a measurement of 0. So just like the income elasticity of demand, our cross-price elasticity of demand is helping us identify, do we have complements or do we have substitutes? It tells us something about how the demand for one curve is going to shift, in which direction when the price of a related good changes, and how big the elasticity is tells us how big that shift is going to be. So that wraps up the Chapter 5 lectures on elasticity. The next set of slides that I post are going to walk through some practice problems and actually do some of these measurements.